October 12, 1972, a Friday morning at the airport in Montevideo, Uruguay. A group of young men, most in their early 20s, laugh as they load their travel bags. They are rugby players from the Old Christians Club, an amateur team from a Uruguayan Catholic college. They're on their way to Chile for a match. The trip had been weeks in the planning. Some had even convinced their parents to come along. There were mothers, sisters, friends. In total, 45 people were boarding a Fairchild military plane bound for Santiago. Nando Parado was 19 years old. He boarded the plane and sat next to his mother and his younger sister. The three were traveling together. It was his sister's first time ever leaving Uruguay. The plane took off. The cabin filled with conversations, with laughter, with plans for after the match. No one on that plane knew they were about to spend the next 72 days in the most inhospitable place on earth. No one knew that many of them would not be coming back. And no one knew that what was about to happen in the next few hours would become one of the most brutal and extraordinary survival stories in human history. Of the 45 who boarded that plane, only 16 would come down from the Andes alive, 72 days after the crash. They were stranded in one of the most remote and inaccessible places on the planet, with no food, no equipment, and by any rational calculation, no real chance of survival. And when the world learned how they had survived, the scandal was so great that for weeks, it overshadowed the real story. The story of what those 16 young people were capable of doing to stay alive. That is what we are going to uncover today. By the end of this film, you will understand how a group of young men with no mountain experience survived for 72 days in the Andes mountain range at an altitude of 3,600 meters, with temperatures of 30 degrees below zero. What decision did they make that the entire world judged, but which none of them regret? And why wasn't the true miracle of the Andes surviving the crash, but what happened after the world gave them up for dead? To understand what happened, you have to understand who these people were. They were not explorers. They were not soldiers. They were not alpinists. They were Uruguayan university students from middle-class families' kids who played rugby on weekends and studied medicine, law, and engineering during the week. The oldest was 26, the youngest 17. None had ever climbed a mountain. None had ever slept out in the open in their lives. None of them knew what hypothermia was, or altitude sickness, or how to navigate without a compass in a landscape of endless snow. Uruguay in 1972 was a small, urban, and relatively prosperous country. Montevideo was a city of universities, cafes, and soccer stadiums. The Andes mountain range was something that existed on geography maps and in textbook photos. It wasn't something real for any of them. It was not a part of their lives or their fears. Until Friday, October 13th, 1972, the plane had taken off from Montevideo on October 12th, but had been forced to land in Mendoza, Argentina, due to bad weather. The meteorological conditions in the mountain range were not favorable. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, decided to wait a day and resume the flight on October 13th. What happened during that flight is something investigators would later reconstruct in detail. The plane was crossing the Andes, following a standard route. To cross the mountain range, it had to ascend to a high altitude, to clear the peaks, and then descend toward the Santiago Valley to the west. The co-pilot, Dante Laguarara, calculated that they had passed the Chilean city of Carico, which meant they could begin their descent toward Santiago. That assumption was incorrect. They were still over the mountain range, but the pilot accepted the calculation and ordered the descent. The plane began to descend through clouds. The passengers saw nothing through the windows, only white. When the clouds opened, it was too late. There was no valley, no city below. There was only mountain, a wall of rock and snow, meters from the nose of the plane. The pilot tried to ascend. There was no time. To understand what was about to happen to them, you have to understand where they were. The Andes mountain range, at that latitude, is one of the most hostile places on the Earth's surface. Peaks of over 6,000 meters. Winds that can exceed 150 kilometers per hour. Temperatures that drop to 30 degrees below zero at night. And a silence so absolute that survivors, decades later, described it as the sound of being dead. But inside the plane, no one saw any of that yet. Only white through the windows. Clouds. The plane had begun its descent toward Santiago. Following the co-pilot's calculation, conversations continued. Some were dozing. Nando Parado looked out the window, seeing nothing but white. And then the clouds parted. What appeared below was not a valley. It was not a city. It was a wall of rock and snow that completely filled the horizon, just meters from the plane's nose. The pilot yanked the controls back with all his strength. Trying to climb, the engines roared. The plane responded, but there was no space. There was no time. The right wing struck the mountainside first. It sheared off instantly. As it broke away, it sliced through the tail of the plane like a blade. The tail flew through the air, with several passengers still seated inside. The wingless fuselage continued its trajectory, sliding down the snowy slope at 170 kilometers per hour. A toboggan of metal and bodies, careening uncontrollably for several seconds that must have felt like an eternity, until it crashed into a wall of snow and stopped. Inside the fuselage, the chaos was total. Darkness, screams. Snow cascaded in through the open rear where the tail had been. The seats had been torn from their anchors and had slid forward, crushing the passengers in the first few rows. Those who could move tried to help those who couldn't. They called out names, shouting in the darkness. Nando Parado was unconscious, struck in the head. His younger sister, too. His mother was dead, trapped between the crushed seats. 12 people died in the impact, or in the hours immediately following. 33 survived, but surviving the impact was only the first problem, the least of the problems that would come later. That first night, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. There was no heating, not enough blankets. The opening at the rear let in the wind and snow. The survivors huddled together in the darkness, injured, in shock, with a certainty that none of them wanted to say out loud yet that they were alone, that no one knew exactly where they were, and that if no one came to find them, they were all going to die there. In the first days after the accident, the survivors tried to make sense of what had happened. They organized the fuselage as a shelter. They blocked the rear opening with suitcases and seats. They rationed what little food was left. Canessa, a medical student, tended to the injured with whatever he could find. They made sunglasses from the visors of the seats to protect themselves from snow blindness. They sewed coats together to make sleeping bags. They improvised solutions for every problem because there was no other choice. On October 19th, 6 days after the accident, something no one expected arrived: an avalanche. A wall of snow buried the fuselage while they slept. Without warning, without time to react, the fuselage was completely entombed under meters of snow in a matter of seconds. 8 more people died, crushed or suffocated inside. Those who survived found themselves in total darkness, surrounded by snow on all sides, unable to move, unable to get out. The air inside the fuselage began to slowly run out. They spent 3 days buried alive before they could dig an exit with their hands and improvise tools. 3 days of not knowing if the tunnel they were digging would lead to the surface, or just to more snow. 3 days of counting their breaths so as not to exhaust the oxygen. When they finally got out and saw the sky, the relief lasted exactly as long as it took them to count how many had survived. From 33, there were now 25. While the survivors tried to recover from the avalanche, outside, the world was still looking for them. Military planes from Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile flew over the area. The problem was that the fuselage of the plane was white, and the snow was also white. It was nearly invisible from the air. The survivors heard the planes. They saw them pass overhead. They waved their arms. They screamed till they lost their voices. The planes just kept flying, without stopping. On October 23rd, 10 days after the accident, the survivors heard something on the small radio they had found in the wreckage that left them in absolute silence. The authorities announced they were suspending the search operations. The mountain range was too vast, the conditions too adverse. After 10 days of finding nothing, the official conclusion was that there were no survivors. The world had given them up for dead. There were 25 people alive at that moment. 25 people listening on a radio that no one was coming to get them, that they were alone. That if they wanted to live, they would have to do it without any outside help. Nando Parrado had been processing the death of his mother and sister for days. Now he was also processing that no one would come to rescue them. And in that moment, he made the decision that would define everything that came next. If no one was coming for them, they would have to get out themselves somehow, or die trying. But before they could even think about leaving, there was a more immediate problem. The food was almost completely gone. Chocolate bars, peanuts, a few cans, all consumed. The cold weakened them every night. The wounds of many were not healing, and the snow that surrounded them contained nothing that could feed a human being. There were bodies. The bodies of their companions who had died in the impact or in the avalanche were preserved by the cold in the snow around the fuselage, perfectly conserved by the temperatures of 30 degrees below zero. The conversation they had was the most difficult of their lives. Some took days to accept it. Others never fully came to terms with it. Canessa described that moment decades later as the final goodbye to innocence, but also as the only decision that could be made if one wanted to stay alive. They decided to consume the flesh of their deceased companions to survive. It was not quick. It was not easy. It was the only option they had, and they stayed alive. The following weeks were a test of endurance that none of them could have imagined before the accident. They organized expeditions to the nearby slopes to try to find the tail of the plane, where they thought there might be batteries for the radio and more supplies. It took them weeks to find it. They found it, but the radio didn't work without the correct batteries. Weeks of grueling effort had led to nothing. The number of survivors continued to shrink. Numa Torquati was one of the last to die. He was the most optimistic of the group, the one who kept everyone's spirits up when all seemed lost. His death was especially hard. When he died, Canessa, who had still been hesitant about attempting the rescue trek, finally said yes. They couldn't keep waiting. If they didn't do something proactive, they were all going to die. There were 16 people left alive. 2 months after the accident, the Andean winter was beginning to relent. It was now or never. On December 12th, 2 months after the crash, Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin began to climb the mountain to the west. No map, no compass, no mountain gear. They had rations of human flesh for 3 days, and the clothes on their backs. Parrado wore 3 pairs of jeans and 3 sweaters. He had 4 pairs of socks wrapped in a plastic bag. They thought they were at an altitude of 2,100 meters. They were at 3,600. They thought there was a valley with vegetation on the other side of the mountain in front of them. What was on the other side was another mountain, and another one behind that. The Andes range was not the thin line that appeared on the maps. It was an entire world of rock and snow that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Vizintin returned to the fuselage on the 3rd day so that Parrado and Canessa would have more supplies. The two continued on alone. They climbed for days. They slept in the snow. They ate just enough to keep moving. Parrado described those days as walking toward death with the hope of finding life on the other side. There were moments when his legs wouldn't respond, moments when his body begged him to stop, to lie down in the snow and never get up again. And Parrado kept going. Because if he stopped, Canessa would stop. And if they both stopped, the 14 who remained in the fuselage would die. On December 21st, 10 days after they had set out, they reached a river. They followed it downstream, and then they saw something they hadn't seen in weeks. A cow. Where there were cows, there were people. They kept walking. The next day, they saw a man on the other side of the river, a farmer named Sergio Catalan Martinez, who looked at them, not quite understanding what he was seeing. Two emaciated figures with tattered clothes and beards that reached their chests, shouting something at him from the opposite bank. Catalan threw them a piece of paper wrapped in a rock. Parado caught it and wrote with a pencil, "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. There are 14 more people on the plane. They are injured. They have nothing to eat. Please, come and get us." Catalan mounted his horse and galloped for 8 hours to the nearest police post. On December 22, 1972, 72 days after the accident, helicopters from the Chilean army arrived at the fuselage of the Fairchild. In the mountain range, they found 16 people alive, thin to the bone, with hypothermia, with unhealed wounds, but alive. When the story hit the media, what generated the most attention was not the survival, but how they had survived. Cannibalism dominated every headline in the world. The Catholic Church in Uruguay had to issue a statement to say that what they had done was not a sin, but an act of love between people who shared their bodies so that others could live. The world debated for weeks whether what they had done was ethical, moral, acceptable. The survivors had another perspective. Canessa said decades later that people obsessed over the cannibalism, but that was only one part of the story. They had survived because they were a team, because no one gave up, because when one fell, the others picked him up. The real miracle was not surviving the accident, but what they did during the 72 days that followed. 29 people died, 16 survived. All of them went on to build full lives after the Andes. Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist and has saved thousands of lives. Parado is a businessman and speaker who has spent decades telling his story all over the world. None of them were ever the same. None of them stopped being who they were on that mountain. The story of the Andes has been told many times, in books, in movies, in documentaries. But what makes it different from any other survival story is not the duration, nor the extreme conditions, nor the impossible decisions. It is that the people who lived it were exactly like any of us. Young people going to play a rugby match, who brought sandwiches for the trip, who were making plans for the following week. And in a moment, they found themselves in the most inhospitable place in the world, without any resources, except for each other. What they did with that is the question that story has been asking us for half a century. What would we do? Tell me in the comments what disaster, catastrophe, or historical moment you would like to see reconstructed with artificial intelligence.